Today our career insight is meet an archaeologist, and this was requested by Molly. So there are lots of us in here waiting to meet you, Sophie. So I'd love to introduce you to the pupils. This is Sophie Clark, who works for Wessex Archaeology and is an archaeologist. So yeah, we've got lots of questions. Can't wait to hear what the career of an archaeologist looks like. So can we move over to you, please?
Yeah, sure. I'll start off by giving a brief kind of chat about how I ended up working at Wessex. So when I was at secondary school, I always had an interest in archaeology, but I had no clue how to get into it at all. So when I was at secondary school, I kind of forgot. As a child, I wanted to do it, but when I was at secondary school, I sort of forgot. And I thought I was going to become a fashion designer. And I went to college to study fashion. And then I moved to London with the hope of opening up a boutique and running my own clothes line. But after about a year or two, I realised that actually I know nothing about business and I wasn't competitive enough to be in the fashion industry. I just sort of wanted to do my own thing. So I started panicking and went back to my mum, was like, what am I doing with my life? Where do I go? And she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I'd like to be a primary school teacher. And she said, in order to do that, you need to get a degree first. So you might as well do something you're interested in. And I thought, oh, actually, I'm really interested in archaeology, but I'll never be able to go to university to do it. So I started looking at the prospectuses that were around, and there was a foundation of science degree, which I found, where you only needed like sort of C's and above GCSEs at the time. I know they've changed now. And to do that, I'd already got the GCSEs, so I applied and they let me in. And then from the foundation degree, I topped it up with a bachelor's, which you're allowed to do once you finish the foundation. And then after I'd done that, I thought, actually, I'm quite enjoying this and I'd quite like to stick with archaeology. So I then applied to do my master's degree at Durham to do museum and artifact studies, which I did. And then after that, I saw that there was a temporary job going at Wessex Archaeology for 3 months to process a cemetery that had been excavated. And I thought, oh, I'd love to do that. So I applied and I got the job. And after that, the contract kept getting renewed and renewed and renewed because we had so much work coming in. And eventually they offered me a permanent contract. And I'm still there today, 7 years later. So that's how I got there. My actual role is I don't do any digging. So I'm a professional, but I don't actually go out in the field and dig. There are loads of departments in archaeology, and the one that I do is post-excavation, where I deal with the objects that have already been dug up by the field staff. And my job is to clean them up and get them ready for the next stage, which would be report writing and museum deposition. So that's what I do, and I'll leave it as that, so you can ask questions.
Well, thanks, Sophie. That's so interesting that you went from fashion, don't you think?
Yeah.
What I never would have expected.
Like,
that's amazing. So who would like to kick off with the first question? Yeah.
So when you get your type of things that you find or they find underneath the ground, and if you can't tell what it is, how do you try to know what it is if it's like unable to see?
Yeah, so that actually happens more often than you'd think. We find all sorts of really strange stuff sometimes. With archaeology, the definition of it is it's the study of material remains left behind by human activity. So that could be absolutely anything that has been left behind by humans. So we do get some really strange things. In Wessex, because we are a large commercial company, we have material type specialists. So we often get stuff in that we don't know what it is. The first thing we need to do is get that cleaned. So one of the objects we actually use is a toothbrush, just to sort of wash the mud off, so that we can have a good look. And then if it does, well, everything goes to the specialist, but there are particular things where we need extra help. we have a material type specialist for each material. So things like flints, pottery, animal bone, we have a specialist for each one of those. Same with human remains. If there's something that really baffles us, we would then go to external specialists. So there are like metal specialists and stuff. Sometimes they're as far away as like Norway and Germany. And because we have to get it right, we would then pay them to either come over or contact them online or send the object over to them and get them to have a look and then write us a report. It's not cheap, but it has to be correct. So that's what we would do.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. I didn't expect that.
Yeah. So especially when it comes to really rare things like swords. Swords are obviously really cool, and sometimes they come with all sorts of different materials on them. So it's not just a case of being like a bronze sword. Sometimes it has things like garnets encrusted on it, and it has traces of animal remains, such as like fur and stuff on it. So we would then we'd send it to universities to get scanned, to look for different residues that might be left behind, things like that. Essentially, I think the main rule is to try not pretend that you know. Sometimes it's okay to just say, I don't know what this is. To write a report on this sword, we need to get multiple people in to write exactly what they know, like as an expert. And then we can compile that and put that with the rest of the information we have from that site and start to build a picture of what's happened.
I didn't expect that at all.
There's a lot more departments than I thought. So.
There are hundreds of departments.
Yeah.
Hundreds? Jeez.
Yeah.
Logan, do you want to ask your question?
So
Nice and loud.
Well, what's the most expensive thing you found when you search for things?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, that one, because as professionals we're not allowed to look at it like that, if that makes sense. So I'm assuming you mean like treasure. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, sort of.
Yeah. So we do get treasure, and it's very exciting when we do. Like everyone sort of coos around it and looks at it. However, there is a thing. There's several pieces of legislation that we have to follow. So there's something called the Treasure Act, and there's also the Portable Antiquities Scheme, and these have been put in place because we do get that there are treasure hunters that go around with metal detectors, things like this. They find loads of treasure and they're like, wow, this is really valuable, and they sell it. A good example of this happening is the Salisbury hoard, where 2 metal detectorists found a huge hoard of treasure. Really, really rare. They dug it up and they sold it, and they sold it all over the world. Like they sold so much of it that we will never be able to find it again. Essentially, it's never all going to come back together. As a result, the context of that find was completely gone. So when the archaeologists wanted to look at it, you know, any of the information that we could have got from it and about the people that deposited it there originally had all disappeared because it had been sold on. So as a result, these laws have been put in place to stop people from doing that, and like to try and stop them putting a value on the finds. So even though it might sound like, oh, you could get loads of money, as a professional archaeologist, I'm not allowed to look at it that way, even though obviously I can appreciate the value. However, because of the Treasure Acts and the Portable Antiquities Schemes, you do hear about these people that find little bits of treasure, like in a hedge or whatever. And again, that then comes down to how it was found, who owns the land, what the metal is, how old the metal is, how much of the metal there is, and then it has to be split out equally between the people involved. And the person who decides that would be the coroner who examines it. So unfortunately, I can't say that there's anything expensive I found, because first of all, I've not found it. Second of all, because it's a commercial company, we don't sell anything we have. Any treasure we have is conserved and then given to a museum. And the reason for that is so that we can then get all the accurate information about how that treasure came about, who put it there and why, can then be taught to the public as well as ourselves, if that makes sense. It's not as exciting as just selling the treasure, but that is how it works.
So do we have, if we were to find some treasure, do we have to, is it law now, we have to report it?
Yes,
Yeah.
you would, but dependent on the situation, depends on whether you would get any money from that.
Okay. Do we have anyone here that goes digging for treasure? And yeah, it's a 1, 2, 2 people here, I think, that actively go and kind of hunt. Yeah,
I mean, lots of people do. There's and there's always a chance you're actually going to find something as well. There are also laws to protect areas where you're not allowed to do that. Places like Stonehenge, there are loads of barrows. I don't know if you've been there, but there are like these big mounds of earth that sort of have no real reason for being there, but they're all completely protected and no one's allowed to build or dig there, because it's known that there is high significance archaeology there, and if it was to be disturbed without an archaeological process going on, the context of that area would be gone forever. Once archaeology is quite a destructive industry, so once the stuff has been dug up, that's it. It can't go back in the ground ever how it was, because the oxygen will have reached the objects, so straight away the objects are at risk of degrading. So that's why these areas in particular have rules on them, but you'd be stopped before you started digging there anyway. You wouldn't be able to stroll
Molly, when you're no.
No.
Molly goes around her own garden. Have you found anything yet? No. That's a shame. Right, next question.
I found some animal bone in mine, but that
wow.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got quite a lot of questions here, so Ellie, do you want to ask yours?
Do you ever like go to a museum and say to your family, oh, that came from us and that came from us, we found that?
Yes. In Salisbury Museum, for example, they've got the Wessex Gallery, and pretty much the whole room is full of objects that have been excavated by Wessex, and they've got the videos up of, you know, our lab and my colleagues and stuff talking about the objects. So that's quite pleasing when you see that. And also we collaborate a lot with Cotswold Archaeology and Oxford Archaeology, a Museum of London of Archaeology. So we often get bits in from other areas, or our objects go to their museums and we see them and can be like, oh yeah, I worked on that. That's quite cool. I like that.
That is cool.
Yeah.
Tristan?
What's your biggest discovery you've ever found?
That's a tricky question as well. So do you mean big as in physically big, like the largest objects, or do you mean the largest site, or do you mean like an object that was particularly important to me?
Like a big discovery.
I mean like a big site, like an area where maybe it was a village or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, big site.
So I'll share my screen in a minute for this one. So one of the biggest sites that I worked on was actually the first one that I was employed for, was an Anglo-Saxon cemetery at Tidworth. But as we were processing this one, they'd also found an Anglo-Saxon cemetery that was very similar at Bulford, and then we found another one that was very similar at Lark Hill, and all these locations are very close to each other and they're within the Stonehenge landscape. So we found the Saxons, but then as we went down further, we also found Bronze Age, which was exciting because that started leading up to, you know, potentially a larger understanding of the Stonehenge area. Not only that, but then we found some World War I tunnels, which we didn't know that we were going to find. And as we found them, we found more and more and more. And then we found massive objects, such as, if I just share my screen, we found objects such as this car, like an entire car went under the ground. Not entirely sure how. But yeah, we managed to get some.
What do you think of that?
Can you see that?
Wow.
Yeah, that's a full-sized car. Obviously, you can't see it at full scale.
That's amazing.
But that's a World War I car that somehow got buried under the ground. So that's an idea of the sort of size of objects that we get. But we also found things like this, which were really, really interesting. It was actually graffiti that was written inside the tunnels that we found from World War I soldiers who were practicing for Battle of the Somme. And because they'd written their names and they'd also written their military numbers, we could then look at the military archives and track down the soldiers themselves and their stories and have photos of them. And then we could contact their living relatives and be like, we found this information, and then they could send us more. And then we could collaborate to make a huge publication that was nationally significant, which was really exciting. Yeah, that was probably the biggest site I've ever worked on.
There's lots of wows going on here. That's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, it was also quite emotional because a lot of the time with the prehistoric stuff, you don't see faces of the people that you're looking at their burials. You see skeletons. Whereas with these ones, all of a sudden we had photos and we had their stories. So one of the soldiers, for example, he'd been awarded a medal for gallantry for saving all his men, and he'd been awarded a specific type of medal, and he died 2 days before he found out he was getting it and stuff. So then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, that's really sad, and wow. And you know, we sort of talk to their families about it and stuff, and it really brings it to life.
There's actually part of your role is that communication as well then, not, you know, it's not all
definitely
digging and identifying, is it? It's communicating and empathizing.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean that's kind of partly why we're not sort of allowed to put a value to anything either, because it's everyone's heritage, so everyone's entitled to that information. So we're not allowed to like get financial gain from it, if that makes sense. We're actually a charity, so everything that we get money wise has to go back into putting it in the community. That makes sense.
Okay. Natalia has a question, please.
So have you ever accidentally broken something or like sort of chipped something off? Like say like you found like a whole like scroll of information and you were taking it up, so like broken part?
Did you
So
capture?
it happens. It does happen. Again, we have a specialist for things that are that delicate. We have a conservator. So if it's things like paper, for example, or very fine glass, so we had a Roman dragon claw beaker once. That was really, really rare and really stunning. We don't touch it. It's something that is so delicate that, you know, the chances are we're going to make it worse if we wash it and stuff like that. So then we send it to we get the conservator to come out, and not only do they clean it up and put it back together themselves using the appropriate equipment, but they'd also take it out the ground themselves, because, you know, the field staff, they are trained to do digging at a certain pace because they're being paid by a contractor. So they're expected to get a certain amount done within a certain amount of time, and therefore they're at risk of damaging it by trying to get it out the ground too quick. So to save it, we then get, again with the swords and treasure, we'd get a conservator out to excavate it in a certain way that's going to cause the least amount of damage, and it will go straight to the lab rather than sitting about on site until it's brought back, which can be, and you know, 5-6 days sometimes.
Okay, yeah. I wonder if any of you got the same question as me, which is you showed the toothbrush earlier. It literally was a toothbrush, wasn't it? It's to be delicate. Is there a particular brand of toothbrush that goes down well with archaeology?
No, I think there was we've got different types of toothbrush. There's like a big pot.
No
some
toothbrush
some are harder bristles, some are softer. It depends what you're washing. If you're washing a sack full of flint, like loads and loads of flint, obviously you don't want a brush that's going to be really soft. You just want to get it cleaned as quickly as possible. We're expected to process a certain amount within a certain amount of time, and you know, things like human remains, obviously you want to be a lot softer. And with pottery, you can brush away decoration that's on the pottery if you brush it too hard. Yeah, so yeah, we use toothbrushes. We also use things like dental tools. So with pottery, decorated pottery, or with animal bone or human bone, there are lots of little holes. When I say that, this is the sort of thing I mean. So this is obviously an animal skull, but you get like holes like there that are really difficult to get to. So that's the sort of thing we just pick the mud out with, because it gets difficult with a toothbrush to do it all the time.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. That's amazing.
That's all right.
Ruth's got a question.
Do you have a favorite like piece that has come through from the digging sites?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of sites that I found particularly interesting. We've all got a few favorites for different reasons. I find this is probably going to gross you out a bit, but I find disease really, really interesting. So when we get human remains that are from like the Victorian period, for example, I find it particularly interesting seeing the difference between a Victorian skeleton and a prehistoric one, where the prehistoric ones, their teeth are immaculate, and there's no sign of disease really. Whereas with a Victorian, you know, they'd have arthritis, there'd be signs of leprosy and syphilis and tooth decay, and there'd be signs of like, you know, abscesses in their gums and things like that. To me, that is really interesting, and it tells a very strong story very quickly. You know, straight away you can see that this person has had a hard life, and you can see that medical care wasn't as good as it is now and stuff like that. And other sites that I find really interesting, if I share this again, we also get sites that are like a sort of modern mystery. So if I show you this one, let me know if you can, when you can see it. I've got a site called Sherford. It was in Sherford. They were building a new housing area, and in the middle of this kind of valley, we found a barrow. And it was like a barrow with like a kissed burial inside it. And that's rare because barrows are normally quite up high. A barrow is like the mound of earth that we see at Stonehenge, which I was talking about. They're normally protected. So this had like a stone-kissed burial inside it, and a stone-kissed is like a sort of stone coffin, basically. And inside that, rather than there being a skeleton, there was like a cremation burial. And normally the cremations are placed like a pot with a sort of organic lid, like of fur or something. But this one had been placed upside down, and then it had been redug up, and some of the stone had been taken away later and then covered back up. And this was all done hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and we're still trying to figure out why that could happen. But what we did find with we managed to find out, looking at the cremation remains, it was a male, and he would have been between, you know, in his early 20s, 30s sort of age. We did find this knife. So they've done like a sort of 3D reconstruction of what he might have looked like. They actually based the image of the person on the archaeologist who discovered him, which is quite funny. So that looks just like my colleague, but then there's also this knife that we found, and you can kind of imagine what he would have looked like, but it also brings it back to life a little bit so that you can kind of, it's like a mystery, you know, like trying to figure out the clues as to what could have happened. And it's not just one person that would do that. Again, it would be something that we'd all collaborate on, trying to piece it together. But a lot of the time, like I said at the beginning, we just have to say, you know, we don't actually know. We can give you the evidence, we can give you the clues, and everyone can come up with their own theory. And that's as far as it can get, really, you know.
Those pupils who are thinking this is definitely something I would like to do, what would you recommend to them? You know, so the school age at the moment, so what do you recommend they go and do, and how do they prepare to get into this type of career?
My strongest advice would be experience. So there are things like the Young Archaeologist Club that you can get involved with. That will give you digging experience. They're often asking for volunteers to get involved with digs. I'd also recommend getting into museum work as well, and libraries, any areas like that's the sort of stuff they're going to be looking for on CVs. Getting work experience at commercial companies, so there's Cotswolds, Wessex, stuff like that. And just, yeah, that, as bad as it sounds, like, just keep volunteering until you've got it on your CV, and then from there they'll start inviting you onto paid digs the more that you get.
That's really useful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that would be my best advice. There's obviously other ways to go about it. I mean, I did it by doing a foundation of science degree, which, you know, anyone can do. You don't necessarily need any qualifications to do that, but it is a bit of a slower process, that's all. Thank you.